Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's live stream with the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a certified instructor with SANS, and I am so excited to be joined this month by John Hammond from Huntress Labs. We are going to dive into the Kaseya REvil attack from earlier this month. We're going to talk about vulnerabilities and anything else that is on your mind. So if you have questions about threat things we should talk about, throw that into chat. So John, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
Hey there, Katie. Thanks so much. I'm super happy to be hanging out with you all, and I'm doing well. How about yourself? It's been a busy couple weeks, I think.
I feel like it's been a busy year or two, or the pace is just not slowing down. But yeah, I'm super excited to dive a little bit into this Kaseya incident. So I guess first question first, pronunciation. Kaseya, is that how you say it?
So I am putting a stake in the ground. I'm confident in Kaseya. From everyone else I've heard in the MSP world, all the other vendors, Kaseya. I don't know about REvil versus REvil though.
I was going to say the same thing. REvil or REvil? Anyone have comments? If you have comments, vote on this. The actors haven't said. I would argue it's REvil because otherwise, why would the E be capitalized too? Right?
That's a good point.
I don't know. I hear other people say REvil, but I'm going to go with REvil. So okay. Important stuff out of the way. So going back to July 3rd, right? Earlier this month, massive, as you all said at Huntress Lab, mass MSP ransomware incident. So let's just walk through this. Okay, so there's a vulnerability, right, in Kaseya, and pretty bad impact, but maybe not as bad as it could have been. Basically, actors exploited that vulnerability, specific REvil actors, REvil actors exploited that and deployed ransomware directly to a bunch of organizations. So John, I'm kind of curious, Huntress was on this really early on and had this awesome Reddit post. What was this like at the beginning when you all first discovered this? What did you think was going on? And how did you sort of figure out? Because I know when we first saw it, we were like, is Kaseya popped? What's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started to get reports around 11 o'clock, I think on the Friday, July 2nd. So just before the holiday weekend, we worked in sort of the MSP channel and that vertical there and working with other partners, with other folks in the community. And some had reached out. I think there were 2 or 3 initially that said, hey, we just got hit with ransomware across not only our organization from the MSP, but all of our downstream organizations and businesses that they support, that they provide IT services for. We thought that was super weird because, okay, if we're seeing multiple organizations be compromised with ransomware all within the span of a half hour, something has to be up. And really the commonality that we saw between that handful and then as the number soon grew, all of these organizations were using the Kaseya VSA software. And VSA is a remote monitoring or management utility and program. So RMM solution that is what you would use to push updates or support and maintenance on those downstream organizations. That was really kind of the attack vector in a weird procedural supply chain attack. I think we kind of correlated this with other supply chain, really normally talking about the technical stack, like a CI/CD thing, an actual update. This was not an update. It was a legitimate vulnerability that could compromise that RMM utility and then hit down through VSA to MSP to SMB and that end of the tree there.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of debate over, is this a supply chain attack? So I guess my take, and I'd be curious on yours, I would say that for those who were kind of compromised via their MSP, I would call that a supply chain attack, right? Because your MSP is part of your supply chain. What do you think about that? Yes or no, or it depends?
So I totally agree, but that it is really a matter of perspective. It's sort of very subjective as to who and what you're talking about. So when we try to say, oh, the number of affected businesses, well, are you talking about Kaseya's customers? Are you talking about the managed service providers? Or are you talking about all the MSP's customers? Because that could rapidly grow. And it's really hard to benchmark or measure the impact of this because you have sort of the 3-prong effect here working from down those tree roots. I would certainly consider it a supply chain, but it's totally about how you talk about it. Perspective.
And it's totally different than SolarWinds, right? I think that we have a habit of everyone really likes to say a supply chain attack nowadays, right. But being specific about what do we mean by that, because it can mean different things. So Steven, if we can bring up the Reddit post, because this was awesome. I'm curious, like you all have done this before at Huntress, where you just started basically posting what you know on Reddit. And like, what was it like that weekend? And what kind of compels you to share out like this? I have to say, I think it's amazing. Like, because I was looking at this, like, okay, what should we hunt for? Like, what's your thinking, and what kind of drove you to do this?
Thanks. No. So I think we're really strong in the mentality of communication and transparency and education. So as soon as we could really validate and confirm, like something's up, something's going down, we wanted to inform as many people as we could. Especially, you see, we're in the r/MSP subreddit. Hey, we not only want to inform our partners, the individuals that we work with, but just the greater community, just the whole landscape that could be affected here and just needs to know for better response, better threat hunting, etc. So you could see we start from the very top as we're uncovering new breadcrumbs. We're finding pieces of the puzzle here. But even as we start to even potentially speculate, oh, we're seeing indicators or signs of this, something happening, how the attack chains unfold. It's like one update after the next. I think we're up to 19 updates on that thing. But it is truly that. It's a very discovery oriented process because as soon as we're learning new things and uncovering more, being in the trenches, just like everyone else is, we want to share that with everyone that needs to know.
Yeah, I love that. And I think in any investigation that we do like this, it's iterative, right? And I love
Absolutely.
that, you try to be transparent up front. You're like, hey, something is going on that people should know about. Here's what we know. And then like later you're like, oh, maybe that was a little wrong, or like we have to change it. But I think this is an awesome approach. And I wish more people in the community would kind of embrace the fact, like it's risky to go out there and be like, hey, here's what we know, because you could be wrong later. But I found this was a really useful tool. And one thing that I thought was really interesting, I'm curious your thoughts on this, is that a lot of the techniques were like pretty detectable, especially, my team focuses a lot on endpoint. Like this wasn't super stealth. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what do you think that tells us about this? And, I'm just curious your thoughts on the fact these were very detectable.
Yeah, absolutely. I can certainly get nerdy. We can go very technical if we want to. But we stated, hey, this was not a malicious update or anything. It was a legitimate vulnerability and an attack chain through an authentication bypass and a arbitrary file upload, and then eventual remote code execution to really detonate the malware, the ransomware, the bad stuff going down. With that said, looking through the files that were affected, it kind of easy to see, okay, there's glaring flaws and vulnerabilities that, okay, maybe we could have done a better job if we had seen this all prior. Looking at the logs, trying to find that threat actor activity, you literally see like HTTP requests with curl, like the Linux command line utility for simply just interacting with the web page in a command line automated fashion. If we take anything from that and they're not even like faking a user agent, they're not trying to say, hey, we're not curl, we're something else. It's absolutely hackers going for the low hanging fruit, right? Hackers spraying and praying, just trying to hit whatever they can. Maybe that is a message we could take away from this. What say you, Katie?
Yeah, I think what struck me is like, it's so easy for us to, say, oh, just look for anomalous things, right? But in this case, that really would have worked, right?
Yeah.
Like, should your servers be using curl to download files? Maybe not, maybe depending on your environment, right? But yeah, I was struck by just how detectable this was. And, many different organizations, right? Many vendors caught this really early on, which I think is a good thing for kind of this community. Not everything caught it, right? And we just can't always catch everything. But I felt like overall the community, like the fact we got this and we're able to do analysis of it, I think was kind of a plus. A couple other things I thought were so interesting, the impact. So, right, you all have, 18 updates on this, but I'm curious, I remember, I guess it was the second or third time is hard, but it was a Friday before a holiday. And I was saying earlier that, I was so nervous. I was ready to enjoy my holiday. And I was like, oh God, this is going to be like global impact, WannaCry level, really, really bad. But like, it wasn't great, but I think the impact could have been a lot worse. And you wrote a blog post recently that I'm curious if you can kind of summarize this. Like, why do you think there weren't more victims, right? 50 to 60 MSPs out of tens of thousands. Why wasn't it a bigger impact?
Yeah, there were a lot of interesting kind of talking points on this because as we really got into the attack chain and how this, because all really happened for one thing, looking at the logs, looking at the artifacts, understanding and analyzing things, it seemed like the threat actors had their initial authentication bypass so that they could get into the VSA servers with a unique identifier for that service, for that VSA server account. And the technical, we're saying, okay, an agent GUID or a identifier for that. The question was, how had the threat actors gotten their hands on those valid, legitimate identifiers? And that's something that we're still kind of scratching our heads over, that's still in speculation. But I have to think that's potentially a limiting factor as to why this didn't blow up even more than it had. Because while we're saying, oh, it's a sort of authentication bypass, well, you don't need a password if in the case of that code, if you were to supply that identifier, but then you needed to know what the identifiers were. So we started to think, okay, were these leaked previously in maybe a recent breach out on the spooky dark web or something? Was there some way else that other folks could track down that identifier? I'd have to think maybe the reason that where this didn't have a larger impact when it certainly could have was really narrow in that idea of that identifier and how those could have been tracked down.
Yeah, so basically, the adversaries somehow had these GUIDs. If they had more of them, whether it was leaked or they predicted it, it could have been a lot worse. So I really love kind of how you lay out the different options. This is a very intelligence thing. I don't know if you have an intelligence background, but I was joking that a really fun thing to do that I haven't done because I'm lazy on weekends, but would be to do what's called analysis of competing hypotheses. Basically, it's a technique where you align your hypotheses, the options across the top, and you list your evidence. And you kind of line up, okay, for each piece of evidence, is that consistent or inconsistent with that hypothesis? So this was a very kind of intelly type of blog post. I don't know if you intended that, but
we were trying to get that language between medium to high confidence on some different alternatives. But there's been a lot of talking points with this whole incident because now, as I'm sure you know, REvil or REvil has gone offline. Seemingly, they just fell off the face of the internet. They vanished. And suddenly a universal decryptor has suddenly appeared. I know we're more than 3 weeks into this thing, starting at the very beginning of the month, but it's like we're still feeling kind of the ashes of the forest fire.
Yeah. I was just bringing up, Shannon Favre tweeted yesterday kind of some statements from Kaseya, because what a lot of people are speculating is, okay, there was this decryptor. And there was, of course, there's controversy about everything in InfoSec, but it was controversial because, I think it was MSoft. Was it MSoft?
Yeah, MCsoft, I think, or however
MCsoft. Yep, right there in front of me. MCsoft was, I think, requiring NDAs to be signed before they would share this decryptor. And that was sort of interesting. People were like, well, they're trying to get people not to talk. Another way to look at that is that they don't want people sharing this decryptor. But there's a lot of question about how did this decryptor come to be? Obviously, you need some kind of keys, or a lot of the speculation I've seen is, did someone pay the ransom? So Kaseya came out and said, okay, we basically did not pay a ransom. And people are like, well, maybe they didn't pay it, but their law firm paid it, or one of their customers paid it. I personally don't know. A lot of possibilities are out there. Another interesting thing, kind of bringing in the strategic side, is a few people have speculated that maybe the Russian government compelled REvil to share it, which I think is sort of a reach. I don't think the Russian government's that scared of the US government about this, but I'm curious, John, do you have any evidence on how this decryptor came to be?
So again, I'm definitely in speculation just as well. Originally, if we saw, okay, REvil is now offline and suddenly this miraculous decryptor has appeared, that makes me think on a knee-jerk reaction, oh, was that some federal intervention? Was that some law enforcement, kind of like we've seen in a different way after the Colonial Pipeline, right? Was that something where we've got Cyber Command flexing their muscles or doing anything spooky, squirrely, cool stuff? When I think about that, I also consider, well, we have a new ransomware task force, right? I would think we might kind of want to put that notch on our belt that, hey, we did this awesome thing. It wasn't a puffery reveal at how this Kaseya decryptor came to be. So I just don't know. But I wouldn't put it past me to think, okay, maybe if we have some of that other legal intervention and work that we've done from the federal side, maybe we're just kind of staying silent and letting that stay under the rug. I don't know, but there are definitely talking points and options for that.
Yeah. I think, no one knows, right? But I don't know. To me, I'm kind of hopeful that there was some kind of, government intervention or government cooperation, because then you're like, great, government's doing something.
Totally.
So I guess maybe we're optimistic in this community just a little bit that like we, as a global community are starting to tackle this problem. So maybe it's optimism. I don't know.
I totally agree with that. I'm a glass half full optimistic perspective. Yeah.
Which is amazing considering like what this community is going through and like all of the things we have to deal with. So way to hold on to that optimism. I'm trying to think. There's just so much interesting here. We had a comment saying no data exfiltration. This is something my team didn't see any exfil, right? I've gotten really used to in the past few months seeing ransomware operators exfil data before they encrypt often. I'm curious, did you all see any signs of data exfil in any of the victims you talked to with this one?
So my short answer is no. And I know I'm a bit long-winded and verbose, sorry. But
it's never an easy answer. You're fine.
Again, if we're getting nerdy and talking about sort of the attack chain, along with the original like ransomware itself, the agent.crt file that was uploaded eventually turned to agent.exe and blew everything up. Alongside that is this screenshot.jpg that was uploaded. And believe me, it is not a JPEG. It's not an image file. Silly, clever trick. It's more executable ASP classic code. And everything that we've seen hasn't been able to capture the full contents of what that screenshot.jpg really was. We could see from the beginning and end of our intrusion detection systems and some archives and packets that we've been able to see. That's what deletes all the logs. That's what sets up the timer to really light off this ransomware when the time comes. But a hefty portion of the middle of that file is gone. We haven't seen it yet. So if anyone has, hey, we're all interested. I want to hear about it. But we don't know the full big picture because we just haven't been able to track down that file. So I haven't seen any indicators of exfiltration, but maybe there was somehow somewhere that we just don't know about.
It's hard to know because none of us sees everything. So that's one of the things I also really loved about the approach that you all took was like, hey, please contact us if you have info because we don't see everything, but then you could be kind of the like clearinghouse and share it back out. So if anyone listening has a full copy of that screenshot JPEG, like please contact John. He's on Twitter, he's on LinkedIn, go find him. So community efforts. And I know you all emphasize that. You all gave an amazing webinar that really helped me understand this. So if you haven't checked that out, that was a couple of weeks ago. There's a link on your website, and I imagine from the blog as well. So definitely check that out.
I'm happy to echo there with what you said and kind of on that community collaboration, not only from the affected victims' perspective, but also us kind of industry vendors and players trying to unravel this thing. We're working with others that are discussing this and, of course, the community of those affected. We've seen responses and comments even in this Reddit thread. Folks, hey, I'm over in New Zealand and I can help. I've got techs available. I'm over in England. I'm over in Dallas, Texas. And everyone coming out of the woodwork and saying, like, we're here to help those that need some surge capacity resolution. So very, very cool and heartwarming to see things come together when an incident like this hits.
We have some optimism, some hope, right? Hope with each other. I like it. So one thing, it's always tough when we're in the midst of these things because we feel like, oh my gosh, this is the first time this has happened. This is like really stressful. One of the things you mentioned in your webcast was that like this has happened before. It was Gand Crab a few years ago. Let's see if I can find the article. So could you tell us what happened in that one, if you recall? Because I think Huntress looked into that one too.
Yes, I will also kind of hunt for the article. That was before they brought me on board, so I'd have to think before my time.
I think this was it. Yeah. We're doing this live, folks. It's a live stream, so we don't I just think of things and bring it up. So yeah, I think this one was interesting. It was slightly different, right? Slightly different, way that Kaseya was impacted, but it was Kaseya VSA that was impacted, right? And ended up delivering GandCrab, a different type of ransomware. And so I thought that was kind of interesting because, like, again, when this happened, everyone was like, oh my gosh, this is the first time. Not necessarily the first time. But I guess I'm curious, thinking in a larger context. Okay, this happened in 2019. This happened in July 2021. How do you think we sort of prepare for the inevitable next time this kind of thing happens? Like, what can we do? Is there anything different, or is it just the same boring, like, defense in depth, look for anomalies? Like, what are your thoughts?
I'm super glad you called it out as the boring boilerplate kind of buzzwords we use and security hygiene we keep preaching. We say that because it works and it's right, and it's the valid answer in many cases. But I think when we've been discussing incidents like this, especially Kaseya, when GandCrab came in 2019 and this in 2021, I think our interactions with them and their response, and even with plenty of other vendors, you could map this out. It's night and day. We really see improvement. We really see a different mentality and mindset when working through things like this. But to your question is, how do we stop this treadmill that we're sort of on? What about when the next one hits? I think a really big lessons learned is, look, we have to hold vendors, ourselves, like us included, have to hold folks accountable. For the code, the products, for the solutions that they offer. Like, this needs to be the most secure thing you're going to offer to the world, especially if it's going to have administrative access on every single one of my endpoints. So we need to have those conversations. One of the biggest things we've been thinking about is, like, those downstream organizations, they don't even know. They might not even know what software is managing each of their machines, because the MSP handles that. They don't even know that this was part of their security stack. So I don't know. We need to have those conversations. We need to communicate, be transparent, and make sure, like, personally, hey, I'm going to work with this new provider. Look, do you do vulnerability assessments? Do you have code audits? Do you do red teaming, penetration? Can we make sure in a even community validated, like, bug bounty program sort of thing? Is this the most secure product that it can be that I'm going to implement across the board?
Yeah, I think it's compelling that you say that. You work for a vendor. I work for a vendor in my day job when I'm not teaching for SANS. And I agree. I think that customers need to demand more, demand knowledge. One thing that I said after SolarWinds that I think applies here, after SolarWinds, we saw that a lot of organizations didn't even know they were using SolarWinds.
Right.
So something as simple, right? We talk about the basics like asset management, but how about, like, third-party asset management? Just know the third parties that you use and, like, what you give them access to. It sounds simple, but trying to track that down maybe isn't quite as simple. And that's where I think, vendors, providers can do a better job of being like, hey, here's the access we need. Here's why we need it. The other thing that really has struck me about this is, I've worked in SOCs for a while. You've worked around this community, and I think sometimes when we're investigating events or incidents, there's this idea that, like, previously we could kind of trust third parties, right? Like, if it's coming from Kaseya, it's a netcom, it's coming from SolarWinds, like, just ignore that. I think from, like, a very tactical security operations perspective, we have to change that thinking and realize that nothing is really known good, right? We have to trust things to make our networks work. But if you see something weird coming from a Kaseya process, like, don't just trust it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was super proud of some of our analysts who were like, they saw, like, when they saw that first event, they were like, is that ransomware coming from a Kaseya process? And, like, mentally as an analyst, you have to take a moment and be like, okay, that is a possible thing. So changing our scope there.
I think it's a valid point. and you hear it in a lot of different ways, buzzwords between like zero trust or obviously a lot of our assumed breach and assumed compromise mentality, but we have to work towards that. So.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've hit a lot of the key points of Kaseya. Anything you could think of, John, before we move on? And again, I think we dropped links to a bunch of these, like watching the webcast you all did, reading out that Reddit post, and then this blog, I think, kind of thinking through like why wasn't it worse? Definitely worth a read. But anything else you can think of before we kind of move on?
No, I don't think. I think we can kind of bundle that up pretty well. But I would reiterate that, hey, I know we've been dealing with this since like the very start of the month, but it's still a entity. It's still ever present, right? Kaseya has updated their public post on this yesterday, and we're still in a recovering phase for some organizations. We're still chatting about this thing. So if for whatever reason you guys, anyone listening in, would like to chat about this or wants any more guidance or understanding, please don't hesitate to reach out. You've got my contact info. Don't be a stranger. I absolutely am here to help and chat. So
it's a great point. These incidents, right, for some of us, it was like a few days, all hands on deck, but there are still victims who are trying to recover and decrypt their files. So I think that's a great point that, just because we've moved on to the next thing of the day doesn't mean that there aren't still victims dealing with this. So speaking on, all of the other things going on. So one of the other things that I feel like has happened this month is there have been a lot of vulnerabilities. I know this is an area where you kind of do research as well. So we got multiple print nightmare ones. I'm not even going to try to identify the CVE numbers because like the term print nightmare is sort of confusing. And then we have Hive nightmare, also known as Serious Sam. And what was the other term for that? Summer of Sam. I kind of like Summer of Sam. I thought that was a creative one.
That sounds much nicer than Hive Nightmare.
There you go.
Sounds much more peaceful.
I can't keep the strings straight. So like I need Summer of Sam or Serious Sam because too many nightmares. I just don't want that. And then just this week, the Petit Potin, I think that's French, that came out and Microsoft kind of talked about that in advisory. So I guess starting from like a broader perspective, one thing that I hear that I'm curious your thoughts on, this is a lot of vulnerabilities. Are things getting worse? People are, criticizing Microsoft, the security of their code. Like, is this normal? Are things really getting worse in terms of vulnerabilities? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a tightrope,
Oh yeah. That's why we like to dive into the tough stuff.
So we were bantering about this kind of before we jumped on the air. And I think you had the thought, maybe we're just really getting better at this and bringing it to the forefront. Maybe we're just finding more and more vulnerabilities and security issues and flaws like this. And we're just sharing and offering the information on that. And I don't mean to take that kind of perspective from you. So I'll let you chime in because originally I was a much more of a doom and gloom, fear, uncertainty. They're like, yes, things are getting worse. There are more vulnerabilities. But I think I side with you now that we've kind of discussed that. I think what sparks that and ignites it a little bit more is that we aren't seeing the responsibility from vendors in addressing this sort of thing. Like Kaseya, as an example, I think they knew about this from disclosure in April previously. We didn't hear word from Microsoft on print spoofer and print nightmare things for some time. I think some folks are still a bit upset with how Petit Potin is being handled. I don't know if there's just a disgruntlement in how we're handling some of these. Maybe that is adding to it. What say you?
Yeah, I like that we're having a little bit of optimism. This is something that I've thought about a lot this whole year, right? Because ever since SolarWinds, it feels exhausting, right? Yeah. And there are months where we have all these vulnerabilities. We have the Kaseya thing. There's so much going on, and it's so tough to know. But thinking about back to 5 years ago, like I feel like there weren't as many researchers sharing things on Twitter or Reddit. I feel like there maybe weren't as many vulnerability researchers. And so we can't measure these things, I think, which is so difficult. We can measure like number of CVEs, but we can't measure like how much more research is being done. right? Because if you have more people looking for vulnerabilities, they're going to find more. So I think it's so tough to say, but I don't know. I firmly believe, just based on like anecdotal experience, which is super subject to cognitive biases, but anecdotal experience based on what I've seen from the community, like now it's at a place where, you know, someone will tweet something, hey, I found this vulnerability, the 0-day. Within 12 hours, like 5 people on Twitter will be like, here are some detection ideas.
Yeah.
And like, here's how we can mitigate this. Like that pace, I think, is a positive thing. Kind of the drawback though, and I always want to address this, is like we're sort of part of the security 1%, right? Like we're following Gossie the dog, and like I'm following you on Twitter, and like when you tweet something, I'm like, oh, we should incorporate this into security postures. I think where it is kind of scary is that these vulnerabilities are out there, and then it's like the small organizations who don't have a security budget. They have one IT admin,
right,
who can't necessarily read this Microsoft advisory. They don't know this happens, and they're not mitigating these attacks for the petit potem, for example. So I think it's tough, right? I think maybe we're getting better, but I hope that all of us are thinking about like, how do we not only protect those of us in the know about security, but those who don't necessarily follow this stuff every day. That's kind of one that I'm struggling with.
I wish I could offer some answer. I wish I could offer some semblance, but I mean, I'm struggling in the same boat. When we keep saying, oh, user education and awareness, like that's right, but I know it's not always effective. Sometimes it's just the best we've got so far. So
yep, absolutely. So I'm curious, have you looked into any of these vulnerabilities? I'm curious because what I found this month is that I've seen, you know, reporting about the vulnerabilities, but then in terms of seeing adversaries actually exploiting them, I haven't seen a ton. So I'm curious if there are any of these that you've dived into, any like examples of, you know, adversaries exploiting Print Nightmare, or any of the SAM ones, anything like that.
Yeah. So I spent a significant amount of time playing with Print Nightmare. I actually helped kind of put together a PowerShell proof of concept for local privilege escalation, so I can nerd out on that regard. Hive Nightmare, we also kind of tinkered with again, Serious Sam and that sort of thing. Truthfully, I'm not all too far deep into Petit Potam just yet.
It's new.
Yeah.
Give it time.
I know Print Nightmare has certainly made quite a buzz. Again, just as you mentioned, there aren't a lot seemingly of attacks or really big things in the news on, oh, threat actors actually taking advantage and exploiting this. I can say I am aware of some organizations being compromised with Print Nightmare. There was breadcrumbs kind of indicating some other stuff in the Sonic Wall. I believe that was Sonic Wall, another recent vulnerability for more initial access sort of stuff. So I don't think it's, you know, it hasn't been a news debacle like Kaseya and other incidents, but the threat is still real, I'd have to think. So maybe more will come.
Yeah, I'm curious. So one thing you mentioned, and this is something that my team struggles with and communicating, is that anytime these vulnerabilities are exploited as part of a larger chain, right? And so you mentioned, like, for example, adversaries will often exploit another vulnerability in something like Sonic Wall to kind of get the initial access and then use this as part of the overall chain. I'm curious for Print Nightmare, like what kind of detection strategies do you think work? Like I always say, like you have to look at the whole chain, right? But I'm curious if there are any in particular that you think work for defenders.
Ooh, so I might be out of the loop in complete honesty. When I had kind of started tinkering with it, the biggest telltale was those printer drivers kind of being added as, while everyone was telling you, hey, just disable the print spooler service. So like, okay, well now I can't print anymore. That doesn't help.
Yeah, people like to print.
Yeah. Even with Hive Nightmare, we were saying, yeah, just delete our volume shadow copies. Okay. I think, and I could totally be wrong, so someone please spot check me. Some of the recent stuff from Benjamin Delpy, Mimikat's Gentle Kiwi, has been showcasing a Print Nightmare method that doesn't add a driver delo. I might be wrong. But what I could say is that definitely keep an eye on those printers and those drivers.
Absolutely. That was interesting. Whenever these things happen, it's always like, oh, we'll just go ahead and delete or disable your printer.
Yeah.
Like,
While we're waiting on a patch, right? So
yeah. Yeah. So literally 24 minutes ago, Benjamin Delpy tweeted.
ooh, we're staying current.
Absolutely current. So yeah, he's a good one to follow on Twitter. Super helpful info there. I think the challenge is always for all of this is, ideally when there's a vulnerability discovered, helping defenders. And I think that overall the community has done a pretty good job with that. Hey, we found this and here's how you can detect it. So Benjamin is definitely one of the many people on Twitter to follow. Absolutely. I found that's how I'm getting the latest about all these vulnerabilities is following the right people on Twitter, which is wild, but that's
I know that's a whole conversation of its own. How did Twitter become the information security sharing center? But it's great.
Yep. Who knows? But whatever works. Even if you don't post tweets, right? That's okay. Just get on there and follow folks like Benjamin, folks like John, so you can kind of keep up with what vulnerabilities are happening and what is going on. So, and you get hot takes and gifts. So that's always a plus as well. Nice. So a lot of vulnerabilities, right? I think that best thing we as defenders can do, right? Keep an eye out. If you have ideas, right? Same thing that you all highlighted with the Kaseya stuff. If you have ideas on detection, on defense, share those. And whether it's Twitter or Reddit, however you do that, I think that's an awesome takeaway. All right. Well, anything else on the vulnerability topic you think is relevant, John?
No, unless you have any kind of specific questions for me. I hope there were still some good nuggets and some good learning in there.
Yep, absolutely. I appreciate it. Well, I'm probably going to dive more into strategic stuff. So, John, I'll let you get back to your research. Thank you so much for joining us today. I truly appreciate your time. Follow John on Twitter, or on LinkedIn, and check out all those Huntress blog posts as well as their Reddit. So thank you so much for all you're doing for the community and for joining today.
Well, thank you, Katie. This has been a real treat. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So we've talked about Kaseya. We talked about vulnerabilities overall. Now let's dive into some other kind of strategic level stuff. My goal with this live stream is to talk about all the threat-related news. And so if you have anything that you are curious about, throw it in chat. I see we have lots of comments here talking about all kinds of issues here. So one thing I wanted to talk about was the series of actions against China. Last week, time is hard, last Monday, we saw this kind of series of documents, including an indictment from the DOJ against kind of an umbrella of different Chinese actors. We saw APT 40 in here. We saw a statement from the president about Chinese actors involved in ransomware operations who seems like they were working for the Ministry of State Security, but they also were moonlighting during ransomware operations. The NCSC, the UK got involved, Australian government, NATO got involved in this one. And so I think it's really important to kind of check this one out. And so if we can go back to my screen share, one thing I'm really interested in is indictments. And I have a list that I'll link out later of just various indictments over the years. Actually, let me just bring it up live. You all can help me wait for me to type. So I have a blog that I have, and a couple of years ago, honestly, I just couldn't remember all of the indictments that were out there because one would come out and I'd be like, oh, this is an indictment of the Ministry of State Security. And I think there was another one like 2 years ago. And so this is just a Google spreadsheet of a bunch of different indictments and legal documents that I think CTI analysts and defenders might be interested in. So we'll drop this in show notes as well, but you can just navigate to my blog post and it's open to everyone. Everyone has view access, not edit access, because that would be melee. But I added that in there. You can see there are a lot of indictments over the years. I find this just helps me kind of keep track of all of the various things. And one interesting note about this most recent series of actions is a lot of people were saying, oh, hey, this was the first time Chinese-related actors were indicted or that the government mentioned they were involved in ransomware. Actually, back in September 2020, there was an indictment that mentioned EPT 41 actors that also mentioned ransomware. So it's a nice way to I can only keep track of a few things in my mind, try to remember all those different indictments. And so this one, APT 40, was the actual indictment. I think these are so interesting to kind of dive into. I think Thomas Rid often will do a really nice breakdown. He's a great person to follow on Twitter. Others who do breakdowns, Pwn All the Things. Matt Tate does great breakdowns, but these are so interesting to read for a few different reasons. First off, just to see what the US government knows. And I think one really important thing about this series of actions for defenders to remember is that what was clear to me is this was very much more a strategic messaging to China. This wasn't necessarily meant to be like the latest and greatest indicators for defenders to use about Chinese adversaries. You might have seen CISA also put out a bunch of TTPs and indicators about APT 40 actors. This is a responsible thing to do by the US government whenever they do any kind of indictment or public release. Give us some indicators, give us some TTPs. That's super cool. The challenge was if you took a look at the indicators, they weren't super recent. I believe the most recent these indicators were about 2018. So looking at that, plus the fact that APT 40 was involved in the indictment, that was the indictment, and then some other actors were mentioned in the presidential statement. This seems to tell us that this was meant to be a strategic action by the US government, by its allies against China. At the same time, useful for defenders to take a look at this, right? Take a look at TTPs, map to attack, and think about, how could we detect these adversaries? I think a lot of those historic IOCs might be most useful. If you had an intrusion from 2017, you still have those details on, going back and saying, hey, I think this might be a Chinese adversary. One thing that kind of struck me was just how normal these TTPs are. This is something I talk about a lot, that adversaries of many different motivations and different groups will use the same TTPs, right? PowerShell Empire, tool that's used by a lot of different actors and red teamers, right? Using steganography, exfil over C2 channel. A lot of these attack techniques are things that many adversaries use, which to me is good news, because if you are focused on trying to detect these techniques, then, all right, you're going to detect a lot of different adversaries. So it's kind of a good takeaway from this, but just remembering that there are different reasons why governments release information. And in this case, I think it was really meant to be strategic messaging against the Chinese government. We'll see how they respond. The general China approach is to kind of deny it, but that's where the indictment comes in, right? The specificity about what the US government knows about these Chinese adversaries, I think is sort of part of that messaging. So we're taking a look at this. Of course, lots of different names. That's always interesting to me when the US government uses private sector names. I think it's a good sign that the public-private partnership and threat sharing is definitely there. So worth taking a look at that indictment if you haven't already. And of course, this picture is pretty amusing. I saw some great memes on Twitter of this one. So double guns from this Chinese actor. Other big news, NSO Group. This was one that broke a couple, 2 weeks ago. Time is hard, as I've said. NSO Group, one of these hacker for hire groups, and they are known for their malware called Pegasus, primarily spies on mobile devices. And these hacker for hire groups, right? NSO Group is based out of Israel, kind of a gray area in terms of ethics here, right? Hacker for hire groups often will sell their services, their tools to governments, and then those governments use them on various targets, maybe legitimately, maybe illegitimately, depending on how you define legitimacy. But it was revealed that the NSO Group tools, especially Pegasus, were used to spy on dissidents in different countries and journalists. There's a lot of confusion over this, and I highly recommend Kim Zetter, amazing journalist. She has this Substack. You can subscribe, but she gives a lot of it for free. Think about supporting her because she's amazing. Didn't sponsor this program. I thought she did a great breakdown because a lot of the news around this was this leaked list of 50,000 phone numbers. And so what happened when this first came out, this story, is people thought, and various journalists reported different ways, that, hey, there's this list of 50,000 phone numbers, and these have all been targeted by NSO Group tools, or not. It seemed like this leaked list was actually a list of phone numbers that could potentially be targeted. They're the types of victims that this software might go after. So a lot of confusion there. So this is a really great read by Kim, kind of breaking down all of those phone numbers. What does it really mean? And so this is definitely worth looking at. I know a lot of my friends who work for organizations that support journalists. It's worth looking into this. One of the things that really worries me about this is that Pegasus, right, that's the tool created by NSO Group, and it operates on mobile devices. Mobile is an area where I feel like this community is not as far along as we are in monitoring desktops. A lot of organizations don't have great visibility into mobile phones. People still sometimes, I think of them as phones rather than computers. Like, they're computers. It can grab your audio, grab screenshots, etc. And so anyone who supports journalists, right, maybe people in certain countries that might want to target dissidents, really worth thinking about how could you potentially detect any kind of bad activity on these mobile phones. And one of the positive outcomes of this is that there are various tools out there that you can run on mobile devices to help figure out, okay, has this device potentially been affected by Pegasus? And so this is where threat modeling really matters. If you are supporting journalists, I have some friends at organizations like that. This is where put this at the top of your threat model, because this is a really serious threat. Got to make sure that there isn't this malware on mobile devices. So great reporting from Kim. And, for any of this kind of reporting that comes out, really important to remember that when, there's a leaked set of information, or there's a source who's unidentified by name, be really cautious and vet your sources, right? When this information first breaks, might be kind of misleading at first. That's another story that I think is definitely worth watching. Other stories. What questions do you have? What have you all seen? I see someone mentioning the Olympics. So Olympics, I don't think I've seen reporting yet about any cyber attacks focusing on the Olympics, but something could have broken while we were on this live stream. Hard to say. For the Olympics, I always recommend looking to the past to try to help us anticipate the future. We can't predict the future, but one for the Olympics that I really look at, a classic case, was Olympic Destroyer. This was Winter Olympics a couple of years ago, and this is a really interesting case because it looks like there was some potential deception there, trying to make it seem like it was one country versus another. So it seems pretty likely that various adversaries are focusing on Olympic-themed phishes, perhaps, or on targeting victims associated with the Olympics. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm very curious if anyone else has seen anything on that. Other things going on. Always a bunch of threat reporting. I think those are the major ones that I have seen. So if you have any other thoughts, any other questions, feel free to toss those into chat. Otherwise, I think we're good, and I'll go ahead and start wrapping up. All right, not seeing anything else come in. So with that, give you 10 minutes of your day back if you're planning on an hour. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thanks for John for joining me earlier. As always, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you being part of the conversation. And with that, have a great rest of your day. Take care, and we hope to see you next month on our STAR live stream.